For my final project, I chose to do a literary analysis on Mary Downing Hahn and the supernatural slash horror genre. So, who is Mary Downing Hahn? She is a children's and YA author. She used to teach the middle grades before she became a librarian and started writing books. I think her experience as a middle school teacher gives her some insight when it comes to writing about young adolescents and teenagers because she's worked with them before. In an interview with the American Library Association, Hahn said that she bases a lot of her novels and characters off of her own experiences as a young girl. I think this makes her stories like all the more relatable for her readers. Aside from ghost stories, she also writes mysteries like Closed for the Season and has actually written over 2 dozen young adult novels, which is super cool. The 4 novels I chose to analyze by Hahn were Wait Till Helen Comes, All the Lovely Bad Ones, Deep and Dark and Dangerous, and The Old Willis Place. Wait Till Helen Comes, which was published in 1986, is about 12-year-old Molly and her family. When Molly's mom, Jean, gets remarried to a man named Dave, she not only gains a stepdad but also a stepsister. Her stepsister Heather is troubled and doesn't try to get along with Molly or her brother Michael. When the whole family moves to a converted church in a rural town, Molly has to protect Heather from Helen, the ghost of a young girl with a frightening agenda. All the Lovely Bad Ones follows Corey and Travis, who got kicked out of summer camp for pulling too many pranks. Now they have to spend the summer with their grandmother at her Vermont inn, which they aren't really complaining about because when they find out the inn has a history of paranormal activity and is reportedly haunted, they take it upon themselves to prank the guests to get more revenue for their grandmother's inn. They did not expect, however, to wake up the real ghosts that have been dormant at the inn for many years. Deep and Dark and Dangerous is about 13-year-old Allie, who is spending the summer with her Aunt Dulcie and cousin Emma. She's expecting a relaxing vacation where she can get to know her aunt and cousin better, because her mother and aunt had a falling out years ago and haven't really spoken since. Allie ends up having to spend the summer keeping Emma out of trouble because Emma becomes friends with a little girl named Sissy, who's just the epitome of a bad influence on her. And then meanwhile, she also uncovers a very dark secret that her aunt and mother have been keeping for basically their whole lives. The final book I analyzed was The Old Willis Place. It follows siblings Diana and Georgie, who have lived in the woods behind Oak Hill Manor ever since the bad thing happened. Longing for a friend, Diana abandons the rules they have to follow to befriend the new caretaker's daughter, Lissa. This sets off a series of events that releases a malevolent spirit who is out to torment the children. Starting with Wait Till Helen Comes, these are just some interesting facts I learned about the book during my research. It has won 11 book awards, including the Rebecca Caudle Young Readers Book Award, which is an award that is given to books voted most exceptional by middle school students. It was actually adapted into a film in 2016, and I have personally loved this book ever since I was in middle school, and I actually watched the movie, and it was fairly accurate to the book, and um, but I still thought it was a bit not as satisfying as I'd hoped it would be. It was a Lifetime movie, so you know how great those are, but I digress. In Wait Till Helen Comes, the story revolves around Molly, whose mom just remarried, like I said, and it changes their whole family dynamic. She has to adjust to 2 new family members, her stepdad Dave and stepsister Heather. And as the plot progresses, it becomes evident that Molly and her brother Michael have an extremely strained relationship with Heather. She's very attached to her dad and doesn't like the idea of him being married to Molly's mom. And she lies and gets Molly and Michael into trouble a lot. It all gets worse when Heather meets Helen, and Helen makes Heather do things that worsen their home situation and continues to get Molly in trouble. Helen is the ghost of the little girl that I mentioned earlier. Um, the relationship between Heather, Molly, and Michael is one of a variety of different sibling relationships that Han just covers in her novels. This one being one of the more unpleasant ones for the most part. Molly knows that Heather is being dangerously influenced by Helen, but her mom and Dave don't believe her. Han had stated in an interview with the ALA that she makes the adults in her novels the skeptics on purpose. Um, Her reasoning behind this is that when asking people if they believed in ghosts or not, adults were the ones who were the skeptics. A recurring theme from the novel that stuck out to me was how Molly wanted to distance herself from Heather and even Michael at times. I think this is something you see a lot in young adolescents, and they like make an effort to distance themselves from those around them and establish themselves as independent individuals. For example, like speaking from my personal experience, my brother and I were close growing up, and I we would play and spend time together. But as we got older and he became a teenager, he distanced himself from me and always wanted to do his like own thing, which is fine because eventually I did the same thing too in middle school with my younger family members and didn't want to be, like grouped with them. Um, Similarly, Molly does the same thing and doesn't want to be in charge of her younger siblings and having to always look after Heather. Han based All the Lovely Bad Ones on the poem Little Orphaned Annie by James Whitcomb Riley. The stanza she derived the book title from goes, "To all the little children, the happy ones and sad ones, the sober and the silent ones, the boisterous and glad ones, the good ones, yes, the good ones, too, and all the lovely bad ones." Kirkus Reviews described this novel as having believable characters, both living and undead, and a classic resolution, making it a highly satisfying introduction to the genre. I like how the novel discusses the topic of poor farms from the 19th century, which is important because personally it was an important history lesson that was overlooked and I'm sure is the same for other readers. It isn't something you typically learn about in the classroom and maybe probably should be. Um, I agree with Kirkus Reviews with what they said about All the Lovely Bad Ones being a good introductory novel to the horror genre. I also liked how Han based the character of Miss Ada on her own grandmother because when authors pull content from their personal experiences, it encourages students to do the same in their writing. It shows them they can use writing as an outlet where they can transform their negative experiences in a creative way. Um, Han uses her unpleasant experiences with her troubled grandmother to create well developed antagonists in her stories. At the time I read this book, Miss Ada was one of the scariest villains in a story I had read at the time. And when I learned that she was based off of the author's grandmother, it was shocking because it gave me an inside look into her real life. Moving on, Deep, Dark, and Dangerous is one of Mary Downing Hahn's more darker YA novels. A review from Dogo Books said, "This book is a ghost story, so I would recommend it to people who like to be scared. This book is a great story and has a surprising twist at the end. The beginning is good, but it keeps getting better." I think Dogo Books is a great website because the reviews are by kids for kids, so it shows you what books young adolescents are enjoying, what they like about them, what they don't like about them. I say this book is darker than a lot of Han's books because some of the characters have to or had to see death firsthand, which is very traumatic and can be traumatic for readers. Connecting back to the previous novels, Allie's mom Claire and her aunt Dulcie don't have a relationship like Travis and Corey from All the Lovely Bad Ones, who were basically like best friends. Quite the contrary, they did not speak to each other because of events that transpired when the two were children. Um, Last but not least, the last book I analyzed was The Old Willis Place. It was also a Rebecca Cottle Award nominee, like All the Lovely Bad Ones. This is another one of Han's novels where she bases the antagonist, Miss Willis, on her grandmother. The trend I've noticed is that the characteristics of Han's grandmother are the most prominent in the villains in her stories, which shows the reader what kind of a person she was and how Mary Downing Hahn felt about her. The story is mainly written from the perspective of Diana and occasionally from Lissa's journal entries. This is also a good introductory novel to the genre because of how it experiments with the perspectives. I very loosely connected it to how It by Stephen King switches perspectives from the losers clubs being kids and adults, like every other chapter. Obviously, King's novel is a very difficult and long read and much more violent and unsettling than Hahn's novels, but as a fan of horror stories, I think Mary Downing Hahn's books had me fall in love with the genre. Between the four of these novels, the recurring themes I saw within them was siblings, unfinished business, and oblivious adults. Sibling relationships, like I said before, are different in Han's novels. Sometimes they're pleasant, sometimes they're strained. I think this is relatable for young adult readers because not all sibling relationships are the same. They may have really great relationships with their siblings, like Travis and Corey, or they may want to separate themselves from their siblings and be more independent, like Molly. The possibilities are just endless, and I think Han explores something new in every one of her books. There are even a handful of novels where the main character is an only child, like Lissa in The Old Willis Place. Um, Hopefully, I can talk about this next theme without giving too much of the plot away. Um, Another recurring theme in Han's books is not surprisingly unfinished business. The ghosts in all four novels caused trouble because they needed to deal with things they couldn't attend to when they were alive. Helen was a little girl who accidentally started a fire in which her parents died but were never found. She was buried alone, and her spirit went to rest once the remains of her parents were found. The bad ones were actually good kids that were abused by Miss Ada when they were alive at the poor farm, and what they needed to rest in peace was for Miss Ada's spirit to be exorcised and have them all get graves with their names on it. Diana and Georgie needed the same thing to happen and have their bodies discovered. Sissy is the ghost of a little girl that Allie's Aunt Dulcie and Mother Claire were friends with when they were younger, who drowned and died. Dulcie and Claire didn't tell anyone about how the incident occurred, and it created a very big rift in their relationship. From these different storylines, I think it's safe to say that this theme is vital to the genre, because it drives the plot basically. Lastly, in all of Han's books I've read, the parents or guardians of the main characters never know what's going on. When they do find out what's happening and become aware that ghosts are involved, they're very skeptical and aren't quick to believe it. Han said she does this on purpose because in real life that's how it is too. I think this is oddly relatable to young adolescents because parents often do think their children overreact at times and have active imaginations. And while that may be true, I still think it can be like a negative attribute at times and kind of discouraging. One last novel of Hans I'd like to include in the presentation is One for Sorrow, which came out fairly recently in 2017. It's based on a nursery rhyme, apparently a trend now with some of her books, but it takes place during the influenza epidemic of 1918. It's very much a historical fiction, which I think is cool because I don't really like reading about that, but as really enjoyed this book because of how it tied in the supernatural genre in it. It also includes bullying as one of the themes in the novel and portrays it fairly accurately according to the time period anyway. And I think it's important for young readers to read about that.